When his own son snarled, "Serve my wife or get out," the father didn't beg, didn't tremble. He smiled coldly, lifted his old suitcase, and walked away from the very house he had built with decades of sacrifice. Every nail, every payment, every dream had been poured into those walls, yet his son dared to throw him out like a stranger. The silence of his footsteps was louder than any argument. 1 week later, 22 missed calls lit up his phone, proof that the tide had turned. And what came next would shake their world forever. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Walking in with grocery bags cutting into his palms, the father stopped dead in the doorway. Ryan, the brother of his son's wife, sat sprawled across the leather recliner that had once been his late wife's treasure. Her last gift before cancer had taken her. His stocking feet dangled over the armrest, a half-empty beer bottle swaying between 2 fingers. The remote balanced on his belly like a crown of ownership. He didn't glance up when the door shut or when the old man set the groceries down on the counter. It wasn't just rudeness, it was erasure. Every memory tied to that chair, every night his wife had curled in it with a book or laughed at some late-night movie, had been smothered under Ryan's lazy posture and sense of entitlement. The father's chest tightened with a heat he hadn't felt in years. He cleared his throat, expecting maybe a flicker of decency, but Ryan only smirked at the basketball game flashing across the screen. "Grab me another beer while you're up," he said without shifting his eyes. The words landed like a slap. The old man's fingers tightened around the paper sacks, plastic handles cutting deeper until they left red grooves in his skin. He had bought those beers himself, a brand he never drank, just to keep peace in a house where peace had already been buried. He had spent his Social Security check padding the comfort of others, while his own dignity sat in silence. "I just walked in," he said, his voice even, his eyes narrowing on the young man's slouched body. "I need to put these groceries away." Ryan finally looked at him, his grin curling into the kind of smirk meant to belittle. "What's the big deal? You're already standing. Don't make it difficult, old man. I'm comfortable." His tone carried the arrogance of someone who had never earned anything but took everything within reach. The father's pulse hammered in his ears. This was his house, his sweat pressed into the hardwood floors, his wife's laughter still echoing faintly through the walls. But Ryan leaned forward, letting his feet hit the floor with a heavy thud, using his youth and size like a weapon. "Funny thing," he said slowly. "Your son and I live here. We pay the bills with my money. Maybe you should remember that before you start acting like you own the place." The kitchen door swung open. Tiffany, his son's wife, stepped in with a dish towel, her ponytail loose, her eyes moving between the 2 men. She caught the tension instantly, but her expression carried no sympathy for the man who had given up so much. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice edged with the same warning tone she had once used as a teenager when she wanted to end arguments quickly. "Your father's being difficult," Ryan said without hesitation. "I asked for a beer, and he's making it into some kind of federal case." Her eyes landed on her father, filled not with concern, but with disappointment, as if he were a stubborn child. "Dad, just get him the beer. It's not worth fighting over." The words carved deeper than the grooves on his palms. She had chosen. Not him, not the man who had carried her through storms, through scraped knees and sleepless nights, but the drunk lounging in his wife's sacred chair. Ryan rose slowly, stepping closer, his breath thick with alcohol. "See? Here's how this works," he said, lowering his voice to something almost intimate in its menace. "You live in our house now. That means when I ask, you do it. No questions, no attitude. That's how it goes." The father stared at him, his jaw tightening, his chest rising with each controlled breath. "Our house?" he asked softly. Tiffany crossed her arms, stepping beside her husband, mirroring his stance like a soldier in formation. "That's right. Dad, you need to decide right now. Either you help Ryan and do what he asks, or you can pack your things and leave." The words hung in the air, heavy as smoke after a fire, impossible to clear. He looked at his son's wife, searching for some trace of the girl who used to braid dandelions into crowns, who once clutched his hand during thunderstorms, who once whispered that he was her hero. But the face staring back was cold, entitled, unrecognizable. His voice was quiet, steady, deliberate. "All right." Ryan smirked, thinking he had won, thinking submission had finally broken the old man's spirit. "Good. Now about that beer, I'll pack." The room fell silent. The smirk drained from Ryan's face. Tiffany's mouth parted slightly, her eyes wide with disbelief. They had expected obedience, not defiance. They had expected an old man beaten down by age, not one sharpening himself against their cruelty. He turned toward the hallway, leaving the grocery bags abandoned on the counter. Behind him, the whispers started, urgent, panicked. But his footsteps were steady, measured, echoing down the hallway he had once walked proudly with his wife at his side. The suitcase came down from the closet shelf with a dull thump. He opened it slowly, deliberately, like a soldier preparing for war. Inside went 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, socks, underwear. Not everything, just enough. His hands were sure, folding each piece without hesitation. The photograph of his wife, Martha, slipped into the side pocket, wrapped in tissue like fragile glass. His reading glasses, his small leather journal of expenses, his medications, everything essential, nothing extra. He had learned long ago that survival required only what you could carry. From the living room came the low rumble of urgent whispers, Ryan's anger laced with Tiffany's nervous tones. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't prepared for rebellion. Their plan had been built on his silence, his compliance. Now they scrambled to rewrite a script that no longer followed their lines. He zipped the suitcase shut and rolled it down the hall. Ryan sat rigid in the recliner now, his posture tense, his bravado cracked. Tiffany stood by the kitchen doorway, her arms still crossed, but her eyes betrayed uncertainty. Neither spoke as he passed. Neither dared. The Buick coughed once, then started, its steady rumble filling the driveway like a promise. He didn't look back as he reversed, didn't glance at the window to see if they were watching. The house he had once built into a sanctuary no longer belonged to him. It had become a stage for betrayal. The drive to Pine Lodge stretched 30 minutes through quiet streets, neon signs flickering against the evening sky. His hands gripped the wheel tighter with each mile, memories flooding back. Ethan's tuition, $40,000 at a private college, the $25,000 wedding when Ryan's family couldn't pay their share, $80,000 from his retirement savings for their down payment. Years of overtime, missed vacations, every dream shoved aside so his son could start life without debt. Even then, his Social Security check had vanished each month into their mortgage, their groceries, their comforts. Love had been his excuse. Sacrifice had been his language. The motel room was small, plain, but it was his. He sat on the stiff mattress, opened his laptop, and spread the papers across the table. Bank accounts, insurance policies, credit card statements. Each number was a reminder of how much he had given, how much they had taken. For the first time in years, he felt a shift inside, a quiet surge of power. He dialed the bank. The automated voice droned, then a live agent came on. "Mr. Walker, how can we help you today?" "I need to cancel the automatic mortgage payment on 847 Pine Street." His tone was calm, steady. "Sir, that payment has been active for 5 years. Are you certain?" "Completely certain. The homeowners no longer qualify for my financial assistance." As he hung up, a small smile touched his lips. One call, and the balance of power had shifted. Tomorrow, the weight would shift further, and when it did, they would learn what it meant to erase a man who had given everything. He leaned back in the motel chair, staring at the dim ceiling light. Outside, neon flickered against the night sky. Inside, the war had begun. And this was only the first shot. The next move would hit harder than they ever imagined. Ryan didn't bother to look away from the television when he barked the order, his voice thick with entitlement. "Get me another beer." The words hung in the air, dripping with disrespect. The father's grip on the counter tightened, the red grooves from the grocery bag still fresh on his palms. His pulse quickened, but before he could speak, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Ethan appeared, his son, the boy he had carried on his shoulders through county fairs, the young man he had worked overtime for to pay private college tuition. Ethan stopped at Ryan's side, his expression calm, detached, almost practiced. He didn't glance at his father with warmth or gratitude. Instead, his voice cut through the room, low but decisive. "Dad, just do it. It's not worth a fight." The words pierced deeper than any insult Ryan could have hurled. They weren't just dismissive, they were a betrayal. A son choosing convenience over loyalty, siding with arrogance against the very man who had sacrificed everything for him. The father's chest tightened, the memory of late nights spent at his desk signing loan forms and calculating budgets surging back. He had worked himself to the bone so his son would never feel the kind of hunger or fear he once had as a boy. And now that son stood shoulder to shoulder with a drunk interloper, willing to humiliate his own blood to avoid conflict. The father looked at Ethan, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of doubt in his eyes. There was none. Ethan's stance mirrored Ryan's, casual, unbothered, dismissive, as though the two men had silently agreed that his authority no longer mattered. It wasn't about the beer. It was about erasing him, one small act of obedience at a time, until he no longer recognized himself in his own home. Ryan leaned back in the recliner, his grin widening, emboldened by Ethan's silence. "See? Even your kid agrees. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The smugness in his voice filled the room like smoke, suffocating, thick, leaving no air for dignity. The father's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "This is my house," he said evenly, his voice low, controlled. Ryan laughed, pushing himself up slowly, towering over him with the swagger of a man who thought youth and height were shields against consequence. "Your house? Funny, because your son and I live here. We pay the bills. That makes it ours." The father's gaze slid to Ethan again, waiting, hoping for contradiction, for any defense of truth. Instead, Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence agreeing with Ryan's lie. That silence cut deeper than any blade. The room grew heavier, the air thick with tension. Ryan stepped closer, the sour scent of beer strong on his breath. "You want to keep the peace, old man? Then you follow the rules. When I ask, you move. When I speak, you listen. Simple as that." Ethan shifted beside him, crossing his arms, his body language sealing the betrayal. "Dad," he said again, softer this time, but no less cruel. "Just let it go. Get him the beer." The father stood still, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths. In that moment, he saw the truth. His sacrifices had not forged gratitude, but dependence, not respect, but entitlement. Every dollar, every hour of labor, every quiet prayer whispered over his sleeping son had led to this moment, this choice, obey or disappear. The plastic crinkled as his hands finally released the grocery bags. The sound was sharp, final, like the snap of a wire pulled too tight. He straightened his back, his voice steady but edged with steel. "All right," Ryan smirked, satisfied, turning back toward the recliner. "Good. Now, about that beer, I'll pack." The words dropped like a stone into the silence, shattering the smug certainty in Ryan's expression. Ethan blinked, caught off guard, his mouth parting as if to speak, but no words came. Tiffany, who had been hovering by the kitchen doorway, froze mid-step, her dish towel clenched in her hands. The father didn't wait for their protests. He turned and walked down the hallway, each footstep a drumbeat of resolve. Behind him, whispers rose. Confusion, disbelief, panic. But he didn't slow. The hardwood floor creaked beneath his weight, the same boards he and his late wife had sanded and stained together 2 decades earlier. Memories clung to every corner of the house, but now those memories felt poisoned, hollowed out by betrayal. He opened the closet, pulled down the old suitcase, and set it on the bed with a heavy thump. His hands moved with mechanical precision. Shirts folded, trousers rolled, socks tucked into corners. The photograph of his wife slipped into the side pocket, wrapped gently in tissue. The journal where he tracked expenses, the bottle of medication, his reading glasses, each item chosen with care, each movement deliberate. He wasn't packing in defeat. He was packing in declaration. In the living room, Ryan's voice rose, sharp, frantic. Ethan's was lower, uncertain. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't prepared for the old man to walk away without a fight. Their power depended on his compliance, and now that compliance was gone, so was their control. The suitcase wheels clattered on the floor as he pulled it behind him. Entering the living room again, he saw Ryan sitting upright, his grin gone, his eyes watchful. Ethan stood stiff, his arms still crossed but his face pale. Tiffany's gaze darted from one man to another, her confidence cracking. The father didn't look at any of them. He kept moving. The Buick roared to life with its familiar cough, the sound of reliability, of freedom. He backed out of the driveway without a glance at the house, without wondering if they were watching from the window. He didn't care. The ties had already been severed. As the car rolled through the streets, his mind replayed the moment over and over. His son standing beside Ryan, telling him to give in, to obey. That was the wound that would never close. The boy he had raised with love and sacrifice had chosen arrogance over loyalty. But wounds could harden into armor, and betrayal could forge resolve. The motel neon flickered against the night sky when he arrived. The room smelled faintly of bleach, the bed too firm, the lamp too dim, but it was his. For the first time in years, the space around him was free of condescension, free of smirks and ultimatums. He opened his laptop, spread his papers across the table, and stared at the numbers glowing on the screen. Mortgage payments, insurance premiums, credit card bills, all of it had bled from his accounts into theirs. It ended tonight. He dialed the bank, his voice calm, measured. Cancel the mortgage payment, effective immediately. The agent hesitated, asked questions, clicked keys. He gave his answers, collected confirmation numbers, and hung up. The silence afterward was heavy, satisfying. The weight he had carried for years was lifting, piece by piece. Tomorrow, there would be more calls, more ties severed, more freedom gained. As he lay back on the stiff mattress staring at the ceiling, his lips curved into the faintest smile. They thought they had broken him. They thought the ultimatum would crush his spirit. But they had only awakened something far colder, far stronger. And as the darkness pressed in around him, he knew the next move would change everything. The game had shifted, and for once he was the one writing the rules. Ryan moved in closer, the stench of alcohol heavy on his breath, his shoulders squared like he was claiming territory that wasn't his. His words dropped sharp and heavy, as if he was delivering a verdict. You live in our house. You follow my rules. No questions. The father didn't flinch, but the room itself seemed to tilt under the weight of the insult. This was his home, his walls, his floorboards, the place his wife's laughter had once filled, and yet this intruder dared to call it his. Before he could speak, Ethan stepped up, his face tight, his eyes cold. The son he had carried on his back through childhood storms now stood aligned with a drunk, his voice stripped of love, stripped of recognition. "Dad, either help him with whatever he asks, or pack your things and leave." The words landed like gunfire, final and merciless. The father stared at him, searching desperately for a crack in the mask, a trace of hesitation. But all he saw was a stranger standing where his son should have been. The silence stretched long, broken only by the hum of the television and the faint drip of the kitchen faucet. The father's hands flexed at his sides, his knuckles pale with the effort of restraint. For years he had endured small slights, biting his tongue when Ryan muttered insults, staying silent when Ethan looked the other way. But this was different. This wasn't just disrespect. It was exile. It was the stripping away of his identity, the erasure of everything he had built. He could feel the memory of Martha beside him, her voice whispering from the past, telling him not to bow, not to let their sacrifices turn to dust. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying more weight than a shout ever could. All right. For a heartbeat, Ryan smirked, thinking victory was his, thinking he had finally broken the old man's spine. Ethan's arms loosened, as though the confrontation was over. But then the father's next words cut the air clean. "I'll pack." The smirk evaporated from Ryan's face, replaced by a sudden flicker of uncertainty. Ethan's eyes widened, his lips parting as if to stop him. But no words came. Tiffany froze in the doorway, her dish towel clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. They had all expected surrender. They had never prepared for defiance. The father turned his back to them, his steps deliberate, each one echoing against the hardwood floors he had sanded with his own hands years ago. Down the hall, he pulled the suitcase from the closet shelf, its surface dusty from years of disuse. He set it on the bed with a hollow thump, the sound reverberating through the room like a closing door. His hands moved with mechanical precision, folding shirts, rolling ties, sliding socks into corners. He paused only once, picking up the framed photo of Martha. Her smile stared back at him, frozen in time, a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he still carried. He wrapped the photo carefully in tissue and tucked it into the side pocket of the suitcase. It wasn't just luggage he was packing. It was dignity. It was resolve. It was the last thread of his patience snapping into something sharper. In the living room, whispers rose. Ryan's sharp and defensive, Ethan's softer but strained. They were already scrambling, already realizing the control they thought was permanent was slipping through their fingers. The father ignored them, his hand steady as he zipped the suitcase shut and rolled it down the hall. When he re-entered the room, Ryan was no longer lounging. He sat forward in the recliner, his posture stiff, his bravado cracked. Ethan stood beside him, his jaw tight, his arms crossed as though bracing for a blow. Tiffany shifted from foot to foot, her confidence faltering. None of them spoke as the father passed, the suitcase wheels rattling like a drumbeat of rebellion. The Buick groaned, but started on the first turn of the key, its steady rumble filling the driveway like an old friend ready for one more fight. He didn't look back as he reversed, didn't glance at the windows to see their faces. The house behind him had become a tomb of betrayal, its walls suffocating with the echoes of voices that no longer belonged to him. As the road stretched ahead, his thoughts turned inward. Ethan's words replayed again and again. Either help him, or pack your things and leave. That voice, cold and detached, belonged to someone else. The boy he had raised was gone, swallowed by entitlement, by weakness, by the influence of a man who had never earned a day's respect. The wound burned, but beneath the burn, there was something else, a clarity, a release. At the motel, the neon sign flickered weakly against the night sky, buzzing like a tired insect. The room smelled faintly of bleach, the bed too stiff, the walls thin. But it was freedom. He set the suitcase down and sat heavily on the mattress, staring at the silence that pressed in around him. For the first time in years, he was surrounded by air that wasn't poisoned with contempt. He opened his laptop, spread his bank statements across the flimsy table, and studied the numbers. Each line, each payment, was a reminder of how much he had poured into lives that had given nothing back. The phone felt heavy in his hand, but his voice was calm when the bank representative answered. "I need to cancel the automatic mortgage payment on 847 Pine Street." There was a pause, the sound of keys clicking on the other end. "Sir, that payment has been active for 5 years. Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure." The confirmation came, a string of numbers he jotted neatly into his journal. When the call ended, the silence in the room was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was charged. The balance had shifted. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders for years began to ease. One call was only the beginning. Tomorrow, there would be more. Insurance policies to cancel, credit cards to close, every lifeline they had depended on severed with deliberate precision. They had given him an ultimatum, and he had chosen. Not submission, not defeat, but dignity. They had thought they could erase him. Instead, he was erasing their safety net piece by piece, until they stood naked in the harsh light of consequence. Lying back on the stiff mattress, his hands folded across his chest, he stared at the ceiling and let the quiet sink in. His son's betrayal had cut him open, but from that wound came something stronger, sharper, impossible to ignore. They had demanded obedience. He had given them defiance. And as the night deepened, one truth crystallized in his mind. The real reckoning hadn't even started yet. Instead of lowering his head, instead of bowing to the arrogance poisoning his own home, the father let the words fall like a blade. "I'll pack." For a moment, silence hung so thick the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Orion's smirk collapsed first, his jaw tightening as the bravado drained from his face. Ethan's expression faltered, confusion flickering across his eyes, though pride kept his mouth shut. Tiffany froze in the kitchen doorway, clutching the dish towel like a shield, as if the weight of her father's defiance had knocked the air out of her lungs. They had been waiting for surrender. Instead, they were staring at a rebellion cloaked in quiet resolve. He turned his back on them, each step deliberate, each footfall echoing along the hardwood floors he had sanded by hand with Martha so many years ago. Those boards had once gleamed with the reflection of their laughter, their hard work, their partnership. Now they carried the sound of exile, the sound of a man refusing to kneel. The hallway stretched before him, lined with photographs that told the story of a life he had built. Birthdays, graduations, holidays frozen in time. He didn't pause to look. He couldn't. Each frame now felt like a gravestone, marking what had been lost, not what had been cherished. The closet door creaked when he pulled it open, the old suitcase tumbling forward with a dull thud onto the floor. He dragged it onto the bed and opened it, the zipper rasping like the opening of a wound. His hands moved methodically, almost detached, shirts folded, trousers rolled, socks tucked into the corners. He packed only what he needed, nothing more. Essentials, survivals. The photo of Martha came last, wrapped carefully in tissue, slipped into the side pocket like a fragile talisman. He paused, his hand resting on the fabric for a breath longer than necessary, then pulled away. From the living room came the muffled hiss of voices, Ryan's sharp, defensive, angry. Ethan's lower, strained, uncertain. Tiffany's a whisper, pleading but broken. They weren't strategizing anymore. They were scrambling, already sensing the ground shifting beneath them. They had built their dominance on the assumption that he would never walk away, never choose defiance over dependence. Now, the foundation was cracking. He zipped the suitcase and pulled it upright, the wheels rattling as he dragged it behind him. Each click against the floorboard sounded like a drumbeat, steady, unyielding. As he entered the living room again, all three turned toward him. Ryan no longer slouched in the recliner. He sat forward, his posture rigid, his confidence drained. Ethan's arms remained crossed, but his lips pressed tight as though holding back the words he didn't have the courage to say. Tiffany stood with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her expression torn between fear and disbelief. He didn't meet their eyes. He didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than any words could. He moved past them, through the front door, the suitcase bumping over the threshold with a final scrape, as though severing the last thread binding him to the house. The evening air hit him cold and sharp, a reminder that freedom was rarely warm or comfortable, but it was honest. He walked to the Buick, the car that had carried him through decades of storms, its paint chipped, its engine stubborn but faithful. He loaded the suitcase into the trunk, slid behind the wheel, and turned the key. The engine coughed once, then caught, steady and strong. He gripped the wheel, the hum of the car steadying his heart, reminding him that some things, unlike people, remained reliable. As he backed down the driveway, he didn't look at the windows. He didn't want to see their faces, their wide eyes, their disbelief. Let them watch him leave. Let them see what it looked like when the man they had underestimated chose dignity over humiliation. The house shrank in the rearview mirror, but the weight it had carried fell away mile by mile. The road stretched before him, neon signs flickering in the distance, streetlights casting pools of pale light across empty intersections. His thoughts churned like the dark sky above, clouds heavy, promising a storm. Ethan's voice replayed again and again, a blade cutting into his chest. Either help him or pack your things and leave. But now, the words no longer hurt. They fueled him. They had expected a man broken by age, but what they had awakened was something colder, sharper, harder than they could have imagined. When he pulled into the Pine Lodge Motel, the neon sign sputtered, buzzing like a dying insect. The building sagged under years of neglect, but the room was clean enough. A bed, a nightstand, a small table by the window. It wasn't home, but it was his. He set the suitcase down, opened it, and pulled out the papers he had carried with him. Bank statements, insurance policies, credit card bills, all the threads they had tied around his neck, bleeding him slowly. He spread them across the table, each page a battlefield, each line of numbers a reminder of his sacrifice. He picked up the phone, his voice steady as he dialed. Cancel the mortgage payment. He gave the address, the account number, the confirmation details. The agent hesitated, tried to ask questions, but his tone left no room for doubt. The moment the call ended, he felt it. The first fracture in the cage they had built around him. Tomorrow, there would be more calls. Insurance canceled, credit cards cut off, every lifeline severed. They had wanted him gone. Now they would feel the weight of his absence, not just in silence, but in every bill, every demand, every consequence. He leaned back in the motel chair, the hum of the cheap refrigerator filling the silence. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. The quiet pressed against him, not with loneliness, but with possibility. He thought of Martha again, of the way she used to squeeze his hand when he doubted himself, of the way her eyes had always seen more strength in him than he could see in himself. Tonight, he carried that strength. Lying back on the stiff mattress, he stared at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down, but no longer suffocating. Ryan's smug grin, Ethan's cold eyes, Tiffany's silence. All of it was behind him now. Ahead lay something different, something sharper. They had issued the ultimatum. He had answered it with rebellion. And tomorrow, when the first payments bounced and the first calls came, they would understand just how dangerous quiet defiance could be. The storm wasn't over. In fact, it hadn't even begun. The Buick rolled steadily through the darkened streets, the hum of the engine carrying him farther from the house that had betrayed him. Streetlights flickered against the windshield, each flash illuminating the lines of his face, each shadow carving them deeper. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale against the cracked leather. With every mile, the anger softened into something heavier, something that dug deeper into his chest. The weight of sacrifice remembered. He had given everything, piece by piece, until nothing remained for himself. $40,000 for Ethan's college tuition, because his son had insisted on a private school that carried prestige. He remembered the overtime shifts, the late nights at his desk under harsh fluorescent light, his eyes burning as he reviewed loan applications. He had told himself it was worth it, that a degree would open doors his son might never walk through otherwise. Then came the wedding. $25,000 when his in-laws fell short, too proud to admit their poverty, but not proud enough to cover their share. He had paid quietly, slipping money where it was needed, making sure the reception was perfect, the flowers lush, the dress flawless. He hadn't wanted Ethan or Tiffany to feel shame, so he carried it himself, letting them stand tall while his shoulders bent further. He remembered the photographs from that day, his son beaming beside his new bride, her family smiling as if nothing were missing. No one in the crowd knew the truth, that the father of the groom had sacrificed so his son wouldn't have to. $80,000 more for the down payment on the house. Retirement savings he and Martha had planned to use for quiet years together. A cabin by the lake maybe, mornings fishing, evenings spent reading by a fire. That dream had vanished the moment his son said, "We just need help to get started." He had written the check, convincing himself it was what Martha would have wanted. After all, wasn't a father supposed to give until there was nothing left to give? The car's headlights cut through the darkness, reflecting off store windows and shuttered gas stations. His mind reeled through the ledger of his sacrifices, not just the large sums, but the steady drip of years. $1,200 a month for their mortgage, $300 for utilities, $500 for groceries. His entire Social Security check funneled into their lives, his own needs ignored. New shoes put off for another year, his own refrigerator empty while theirs was stocked. Love had been his excuse, his shield against the truth. He had convinced himself it was loyalty, that by carrying them, he was protecting them. But as the Buick pushed farther down the road, the truth sharpened like a knife. He had been enabling them, feeding a hunger that would never be satisfied. The neon sign of Pine Lodge Motel flickered into view, buzzing faintly against the night sky. He pulled into the cracked parking lot, gravel crunching under the tires. The building sagged with age, paint peeling from its sides, but it offered something he hadn't had in years: independence. He parked, killed the engine, and sat for a long moment staring at the dark silhouette of the mountains in the distance. His chest ached with the weight of memory. Martha's voice echoed faintly in his mind, the way she used to warn him not to give too much, not to let Ethan lean so hard that he forgot how to stand on his own. He had ignored her, convinced he knew best. And now, here he was, alone in a motel parking lot, the sum of his sacrifices nothing more than receipts in his mind and entitlement in his son's eyes. Inside the room, the air was thick with the smell of bleach. He set the suitcase down on the luggage rack and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged under his weight, springs groaning. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. The silence pressed in, but it was different from the silence of his house. This silence wasn't laced with judgment or expectation. It was hollow, empty, but it belonged to him. He pulled the laptop from his bag and set it on the small table by the window. The glow of the screen cast a pale light across the room as he opened his online banking. Numbers filled the screen, numbers that represented decades of sweat, denial, and patience. He saw the college tuition payments, the wedding expenses, the down payment transfer, the monthly withdrawals for the mortgage, utilities, and groceries. It was all there, a history written in digits and decimals, undeniable proof of what he had given. His finger hovered over the trackpad, his heart pounding as if he were about to leap from a cliff. Then slowly he began. The first call was to the bank. The representative's voice was polite, efficient, but he heard the faint edge of surprise when he said, "Cancel the automatic mortgage payment." He repeated the address, the account, the details. When the confirmation number was finally read back to him, he wrote it down with steady hands. One chain severed. The second call was to the insurance company. Tiffany's Honda, Ryan's Silverado, both insured under his policy. Vehicles he never drove, accidents he'd never cause. "Remove them from my coverage," he said firmly. Another confirmation number, another weight lifted. Then the credit cards. 3 accounts where Tiffany had been an authorized user, her charges piling up, her excuses always easy to believe. He listened as the representative explained the process, then interrupted. "Remove her immediately. No more charges, no more bleeding." Each call was like a hammer striking against the bars of a cage. With every confirmation number, every canceled payment, he felt his shoulders straighten. By the time he finished, the flimsy motel chair seemed like a throne. He leaned back, staring at the papers spread across the table, the trail of reference numbers and dates that marked the beginning of his independence. For years, he had been their foundation. Tonight, he had pulled the ground out from under them. The phone lay silent beside him, but he knew it wouldn't last. They would notice soon. The mortgage unpaid, the insurance gone, the credit cards blocked. The calls would come, first confused, then angry, then desperate. He almost smiled at the thought. For once, it wouldn't be him scrambling to fix their lives. It would be them, finally forced to stand on legs that had grown weak from leaning on his. He closed the laptop and walked to the window. Outside, the motel parking lot was empty, save for a single pickup truck, its bed filled with suitcases. A man loaded the last bag while his wife directed quietly, their movements practiced, harmonious. They moved like he and Martha once had, a rhythm built from years of trust and shared burdens. His chest tightened again, not with anger this time, but with longing. That kind of partnership was gone from his life, but dignity, that was still his to claim. He turned back to the room, the echo of Ethan's voice still rattling in his head. Either help him or pack your things and leave. He had chosen. And tomorrow, when the sun rose and the first bills arrived without his safety net to cushion the blow, they would understand the true cost of betrayal. He lay down on the stiff mattress, the springs groaning beneath him, his eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling. Sleep came slow, heavy with memory, but somewhere beneath the ache there was something sharper, a spark of satisfaction. For the first time in years, the scales were shifting. The man they had thought they could erase was rewriting the rules. And this was only the beginning. The real lesson was still to come. The motel room was small, barely larger than the bed itself, the wallpaper peeling in strips that curled like tired fingers. A single lamp burned weakly in the corner, casting yellow light across a flimsy table that wobbled when he set his papers down. He pulled out the stack of bank statements, insurance policies, credit card bills, and spread them carefully across the surface. Each page was a record of his sacrifice, each line of numbers a history of how he had been bled dry for years. His chest ached with the weight of it all, grief pressing down like a stone. But beneath the grief came something else, clarity. He stared at the figures, at the trail of dollars drained from his life into theirs. And for the first time in a long while, he saw the truth, not as obligation, but as choice. His hand trembled when he lifted the phone, but his voice was steady when the bank representative answered. "Cancel the automatic mortgage payment," he said. There was a pause on the other end, keys clicking, confusion in the agent's tone. "Sir, that payment has been active for 5 years. Are you certain?" His answer was firm. "I've never been more certain." When the confirmation number was read back to him, he wrote it neatly in his journal, his pen steady as stone. He set the phone down slowly, and in the silence that followed, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Power. Quiet, unshakable power. He leaned back in the creaking motel chair, the sound of the refrigerator humming in the corner, and let the moment sink in. One call, one chain broken. The house would not be paid for. They would discover it soon enough, confusion turning to anger, then panic. For years he had been their safety net, the invisible force that caught every fall, patched every hole, carried every weight. Tonight he had cut the rope. For the first time in decades, the burden shifted back to where it belonged. But one call wasn't enough. His eyes moved over the papers spread before him, tracing the familiar numbers with a finger. The car insurance policy. 3 years of payments covering vehicles he didn't drive. Tiffany's Honda, Ryan's Silverado, each insured under his name, each month pulling money from his pocket. He picked up the phone again, the plastic warm against his ear. "Remove them from my coverage," he told the agent. Another confirmation number, another weight lifted, then the credit cards. 3 accounts, each one bled by charges he hadn't made. Tiffany's name had been attached to all of them, her shopping, her bills, her little luxuries quietly piling onto his shoulders. He listened to the representative explain the procedure, then interrupted. "Remove her immediately." His words cut through with no room for negotiation. The response came, professional and polite. Confirmation number. Another link in the chain severed. He hung up the phone and sat back, breathing deeply. The flimsy motel chair beneath him now felt like a throne. The papers spread before him no longer a record of defeat, but a map of freedom. Each line he crossed off was another step away from servitude. Each call was a declaration, not just of independence, but of war. They had demanded obedience. They had given him an ultimatum. And he had answered it not with submission, but with precision. Hours passed, the clock on the nightstand ticking loud in the silence. He scribbled notes in his journal, writing down confirmation numbers, dates, the names of agents he had spoken to. Each entry was a piece of armor, proof that he was no longer their victim. By midnight, he had made 8 calls. The mortgage, the insurance, the credit cards, even the life insurance policy that once listed his son as a beneficiary. All of it undone with polite conversations, with legal precision, with the calm assurance of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. When he finally leaned back, his eyes burned with exhaustion, but his chest felt lighter. The papers were no longer weights pressing him down. They were trophies, each one marked with a confirmation number that proved he had taken back what was his. He stared at them for a long while, his mind replaying the sacrifices that had led him here, the overtime hours, the checks written in silence, the groceries carried into a house that no longer welcomed him. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel regret. He felt release. He walked to the window, pulled the curtain aside, and looked out at the parking lot. The neon motel sign buzzed weakly, the letters flickering in and out. Across the lot, an older couple loaded suitcases into a truck, their movements practiced, their rhythm born from years of partnership. He watched them with a pang of longing, remembering the way Martha and he once moved like that, side by side, wordless but united. His hand rested on the glass, the cool surface grounding him. That life was gone, but dignity, that was still his. The phone on the table remained silent, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. Tomorrow, the calls would start. First the confusion, then the anger, then the desperation. He could almost hear their voices already. Tiffany's panicked pleas, Ryan's threats laced with arrogance, Ethan's tone shifting from indifference to demand. He smiled faintly, the curve of his lips sharp. Let them call. Let them feel the absence of the safety net they had taken for granted. This time, he wouldn't answer. He sat back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The grief was still there, heavy in his chest, but it was no longer suffocating. It had sharpened into something else, something steadier. Resolve. He had spent 5 years carrying them, protecting them from consequences, sacrificing everything in the name of love. Tonight, that ended. Tonight, he had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. As the motel light flickered and the night deepened, his mind steadied with a single truth. They thought they had erased him, reduced him to a servant in his own home, but they had underestimated the strength of quiet rebellion. He had left with nothing but a suitcase, but he carried something they couldn't touch, the power of choice. And tomorrow, when the first missed payment triggered alarms, when the first insurance lapse left them exposed, when the credit cards were denied at the register, they would understand what he had chosen. They would see the cost of their ultimatum. The night closed in around him, the silence heavy but clean, like the pause before a storm. He lay back on the stiff mattress, the faint scent of bleach lingering in the air, his eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling. His hand rested lightly on the journal filled with confirmation numbers, proof of his rebellion. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadied. For the first time in years, he drifted into sleep not as a man burdened by sacrifice, but as a man preparing for war. And when morning came, the world on the other side of that motel door would never be the same again. The motel room stayed the same, dim light, thin walls, the steady hum of the old refrigerator. But outside those walls, the world he had left behind was unraveling. Days passed, and with each one came a new flood of messages on his phone. At first, the tone was light, almost casual. "Dad, the bank must have made a mistake. Call him back, will you?" Ethan's voice carried a thin thread of confidence, the kind born of a man who believed the safety net would always be there. But the next day, the confidence faltered. "Dad, the mortgage didn't go through again. They're saying we're late. Did you forget to fix the transfer?" By the third day, the cracks were impossible to hide. He sat at the motel's flimsy desk, listening as the messages piled higher, his finger hovering over the delete button, his face calm, unreadable. The anger came next. Ryan's voice, sharp and venomous, filled the tiny room. "Old man, you think you can just walk away? You owe us. Get it fixed, or I swear." The threat cut off as if even Ryan had run out of venom, replaced by a silence that spoke louder than his rage. The next message was softer, almost pathetic. "Look, just fix it, all right? We can talk after. Don't make this harder than it has to be." By the end of the week, desperation had swallowed them whole. Ethan's voice cracked with panic, each word weighted with fear. "Dad, please. They're threatening foreclosure. They're saying we have 30 days or we lose everything. I don't know what to do." For years, Ethan had stood tall, propped up by his father's money, his arrogance inflated by the cushion of sacrifice beneath him. Now stripped of that foundation, his tone was that of a lost boy, not a man. The father listened to each word without flinching. His thumb pressed delete after every message, the tiny click of the button like the pulling of a trigger. Each deletion was another act of rebellion, another strike of the hammer against the chains that had bound him. He didn't answer. He didn't call back. The silence became his weapon, sharp and unforgiving. At night, he lay on the stiff motel mattress, the faint glow of the street lamp leaking through the blinds, and thought of Martha. She had always warned him this day might come, that giving too much would teach Ethan not gratitude, but dependency. He had ignored her, blinded by love, convinced that sacrifice was the highest form of fatherhood. But now, as he listened to the messages dissolve from anger into pleading, he understood the truth she had carried. Love wasn't about giving endlessly. It was about teaching resilience, even if it came through pain. By the 10th day, the desperation in their voices had turned frantic. Ryan no longer barked commands. He begged, his arrogance stripped clean. "Please, just one more payment. I'll pay you back, I swear. I'll do whatever you want." Ethan's tone had shifted too, softened by fear. "Dad, they're sending letters now. Tiffany's crying every night. I can't fix this without you." The father sat at the desk, journal open before him, each confirmation number neatly written in rows. Each call he had made recorded like a soldier's tally. He ran his fingers over the ink, steady and calm, and let the phone ring, unanswered, beside him. The man who had once been a servant in his own house was gone. What remained was someone sharper, harder, a man who had discovered the cold strength of silence. On the 12th day, the motel phone rang. Not his cell, but the landline on the nightstand, its shrill ring cutting through the room like a blade. He stared at it, the sound vibrating in his chest, and didn't move. When the ringing finally stopped, the quiet was louder than before. He walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign buzzing faintly against the night. For the first time in years, he felt no weight pressing on him, only freedom. But freedom had a cost, and soon that cost would come crashing down on the ones who had taken him for granted. He could almost see it, the foreclosure notice pinned to their front door, Ryan's smirk replaced by panic, Tiffany's tears staining the papers, Ethan's pride crumbling under the reality of consequence. For years they had lived as if he were an endless well. Now the well had run dry, and they were choking on the dust. He let the curtain fall back into place, turned, and looked at the stack of papers on the table. His eyes lingered on the empty space beside them, where Martha's photograph rested in the side pocket of his suitcase. He thought of her then, her voice calm and steady, her hands always grounding him. "Don't carry them forever," she had once said. "If you do, they'll never learn to walk." He had carried them anyway, but now he had finally set them down. The phone buzzed again. Another voicemail waiting, another plea recorded. He didn't bother listening this time. He pressed delete without hesitation, the click echoing in the quiet room. The shift of power wasn't coming. It had already begun, and the avalanche of their desperation was only the first rumble of a collapse they never saw coming. He leaned back in the chair, his eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling, his heartbeat steady. They had demanded obedience, and he had given them silence. They had given him an ultimatum, and he had answered with defiance. The balance of power had shifted, and nothing in their world would ever be the same again, and tomorrow the storm would hit harder. The knock came just after dusk, hard and hurried, rattling the thin motel door in its frame. He didn't move at first. He let the sound echo in the silence of the room, his eyes fixed on the stack of papers spread across the table, the journal filled with confirmation numbers, the evidence of everything he had undone. When the knocking grew louder, more frantic, he finally rose, his chair scraping against the worn carpet. The chain lock slid free with a metallic clink, and he pulled the door open. Ethan stood on the threshold, his face pale and drawn, Ryan just behind him. His usual swagger replaced with something brittle. Panic was written in every line of their posture. "Dad, we need to talk," Ethan started, his voice unsteady, reaching for calm but cracking around the edges. Ryan, for once, didn't interrupt. His eyes darted past the door into the room, restless, uneasy, as if expecting an ambush. The father leaned against the door frame, one hand on the edge, his expression carved from stone. He let the silence stretch until Ethan shifted under the weight of it. Finally, Ethan spoke again, softer this time. "Look, about what was said back at the house. Maybe it came out wrong. We didn't mean it the way you took it." Ryan jumped in quickly, eager to rewrite history. "Yeah, you know how it is. Things get heated, words get twisted. We never wanted you to leave. That wasn't the point." The father's eyes narrowed. His voice, when it came, was calm, deliberate. "I remember every word. Ryan, you told me I live in your house, and I follow your rules. No questions. And Ethan, you told me to either help him with whatever he asks or pack my things and leave." Ethan's face flinched as if struck. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the words thrown back at him with surgical precision. The father didn't raise his voice, didn't let anger color his tone. The truth, delivered quietly, was sharper than any shout. "I didn't misunderstand," he continued. "I simply chose. You gave me two options. I took one. I left." Their silence was immediate, their eyes searching his face for softness, for weakness, for the familiar man who had always caved under their demands. But he wasn't there anymore. What they saw instead was resolve, cold and unshakable. Ryan tried to recover, his hands lifting in a gesture meant to disarm. "Come on, old man, don't be like this. You know we didn't mean it like that. We need you back home. Things are complicated without you." His tone faltered at the end, his usual arrogance bleeding into desperation. The father watched him, unblinking. "Complicated?" he asked, his voice edged with steel. "You mean the mortgage you can't cover? The utilities piling up? The groceries you can't afford without my check?" His words sliced the air, each one hitting harder than the last. "That's not complicated. That's consequence." Ethan stepped forward, his hands spread as though he could physically bridge the chasm between them. "Dad, please. We made mistakes, all right? We said things we shouldn't have, but you can't just walk away from family. We need you." For a moment, the father's eyes softened, not with pity, but with recognition. He heard the tremor in Ethan's voice, saw the cracks in his pride, the boy beneath the man's mask finally showing through. But the memory of the ultimatum, the sting of betrayal in his own living room, was stronger. "You had a choice too," he said quietly, "and you chose to side with a man who disrespected me in my own house. You chose to stand against me when all I'd ever done was stand for you. You told me to leave. Now you want me back because the walls are closing in." Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes darting downward, shame flickering across his face. Ryan shifted again, the panic rising. "So what now? You just leave us to drown?" The father stepped forward, closing the distance between them until his presence filled the doorway. His voice dropped, sharp and final. "What now? Now you learn what it feels like to live without me fixing everything. You wanted me gone. You have your wish." Neither man spoke. The silence between them was heavier than the motel walls could hold, pressing in until even the buzzing neon sign outside seemed to fade. Ethan's lips parted as if to plead one more time, but the words withered before they left his throat. Ryan clenched his jaw, his eyes darting away, no longer able to meet the steady gaze holding him in place. The father straightened, his hand on the door. "Go home," he said flatly. Figure it out yourselves. I won't be the net you fall into anymore." And with that, he closed the door slowly, the latch clicking into place like the slam of a gavel. On the other side, the voices rose, muffled, frantic, colliding with the cheap wood, but he didn't listen. He walked back to the table, sat down in the creaking chair, and stared at the papers once more. The motel room was quiet, but inside that quiet was strength. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one begging at the door. He wasn't the one holding on to people who had already let go. He picked up his pen, wrote the date in his journal, and underlined it. Tonight, they had come to him not with commands, but with desperation. Tonight, they had seen the collapse of the control they once held, and tomorrow the collapse would spread even further. He stood by the window, the thin motel curtain clutched loosely in his hand, and watched their figures retreat across the parking lot. Ethan's shoulders sagged, his stride uneven, his head tilted down, like a man dragging the weight of failure behind him. Ryan followed a step behind, his hands balled into fists, but his swagger gone. Every ounce of his arrogance stripped clean by the reality they could no longer deny. The father didn't move. He let the sight of their defeat etch itself into his memory, not as triumph, but as clarity. For years he had poured out his life in numbers, dollars, hours, sacrifices measured in receipts and sweat. But the truth unfolding before him wasn't about money. It was about dignity. The door clicked softly shut behind him, sealing them out and him in. The quiet filled the room like oxygen, every breath sharper, clearer. He sat back down at the table, the stack of bank papers spread out like a battlefield map, and stared at the rows of confirmation numbers scrawled in his journal. Each line was more than a record of transactions. It was a mark of defiance, proof that he had chosen not to be erased. His hand rested on the pen, his reflection dim in the motel's cracked mirror. And for the first time in decades, he didn't see a man bent beneath the weight of others. He saw a man standing straight, unbroken, carrying only what he chose. The realization burned in him. It had never been the checks that kept his family bound together. It had been the respect he thought those checks would buy. But respect built on dependency was never respect at all. The moment they demanded obedience instead of gratitude, the fragile bond snapped. Family could survive distance, disappointment, even anger. But not that. Not the demand to trade dignity for acceptance. That was the moment family became something else, something hollow, something transactional. He leaned back in the chair, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the neon sign outside. Freedom didn't feel grand or triumphant. It felt steady. It felt quiet. It felt like breathing clean air after years of smoke. He thought of Martha, of the way she used to remind him that a man's worth wasn't measured in what he gave up, but in what he refused to lose. He had lost her, but he would not lose himself. Not now. Not to them. He walked to the suitcase resting against the wall, unzipped the side pocket, and pulled out the framed photograph of her. He set it on the table, the glass catching the lamplight. Her smile looked back at him, calm, knowing, as if she had been waiting for him to come to this exact moment. He touched the edge of the frame lightly, his voice a whisper. "I finally stopped carrying them, Martha." His chest tightened, but it wasn't grief this time. It was release. The phone buzzed again, vibrating against the table. Another message waiting. Another voice recording, trying to claw its way back into his life. He didn't reach for it. He let it buzz, then fall silent, the red light blinking against the dim room. His thumb hovered for only a second before pressing delete. The screen went dark. The power wasn't in answering anymore. It was in not answering at all. Outside, a truck engine roared to life. tires crunching over gravel as Ethan and Ryan drove off into the night. He didn't watch them go. He had already seen enough to know how their story would unravel without him. The foreclosure notices, the denied credit cards, the insurance cancellations. All of it cascading into the kind of storm they had never learned to weather, because he had always shielded them from the rain. Now, for the first time, they would feel it full force. He returned to the table, opened his journal, and wrote a single sentence beneath the rows of numbers. Respect is not negotiable. The pen dug deep into the paper, leaving grooves that cut through the page beneath. He closed the book, placed it carefully beside Martha's photograph, and let the words linger in the air like a vow. The motel bed creaked as he sat down, the springs groaning under his weight. He leaned back against the headboard, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the hum of the neon bleeding faintly through the thin walls. The storm inside him had quieted. The bitterness, the rage, the grief. It had burned itself out, leaving behind something cleaner. Not joy, not triumph, but peace. A kind of peace he hadn't known since before Martha passed, before sacrifice had become his second skin, before love had been twisted into chains. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadied, and for a long moment the silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of strength, full of clarity, full of the dignity he had thought was lost, but had only been waiting for him to reclaim it. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness settle, and knew with certainty that tomorrow would come without dread. Tomorrow, he wouldn't wake up wondering how much more he had to give. Tomorrow, he would wake up free. And somewhere beyond tomorrow, the true reckoning would begin. Life has a way of testing how much we're willing to give, and sometimes love can blind us into sacrificing too much. This story is more than a tale of family betrayal. It's a reminder that dignity is worth more than money, and respect cannot be bought with endless generosity. Many older adults know the feeling of pouring everything into children or relatives, believing that love is measured by sacrifice. But the truth is clearer. When giving turns into enabling, gratitude disappears and entitlement grows. Real family bonds are built on respect, not dependency. The moment someone demands obedience over appreciation, the relationship is already broken. For seniors, this lesson carries special weight. Your years of hard work, your savings, your wisdom, these are not tools for others to exploit. They are the foundation of the independence and dignity you have earned. Choosing peace and self-respect is not selfish. It is necessary. When you stop carrying those who refuse to walk, you discover freedom. And sometimes, the quiet power of saying enough is the greatest gift you can give yourself. If this message resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe and share your own story in the comments. I'd love to hear your voice.